Hello, everybody. Welcome to our May Training Tuesday event for OU Campus. Today's topic is accessibility in 2018. We'll be covering the ways accessibility guidelines are changing, what to expect in the future, and some common fixes. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode as this session is being recorded. If you have a question during the presentation, please use the Q&A function found at the bottom of your webinar screen. For some of our return regular attendees, we know this is a new interface that might take a little getting used to, so please don't hesitate to ask questions. To exit full screen, hover over the top of the window, click View Options, and select Exit Full Screen. We will attempt to address all your questions during the presentation. After the formal presentation is ended, we will review and answer all remaining questions. Your presenter today is David Morton, Sales Engineer at OmniUpdate. David, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Eric. I appreciate everyone's time today, and we'll go ahead and jump in for the agenda for the day. I always like to start off any accessibility talk with the 5 W's of accessibility. Also go over new accessibility guidelines that will be coming up pretty soon as we see the WCAG, the recommended guidelines for the upcoming year. And then also take those guidelines and really explain them in plain English. So sometimes reading through those guidelines, they're kind of hard to decipher. So I'm going to go through each one. I think there's 17 of the recommended guidelines. We'll just be talking about them in plain English. And then also some remediation for existing sites that you may manage or pages individually. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. And as I said, I like to start off with kind of the 5 W's. We won't spend long here, but you're on this Training Tuesday, so know that you have some interest in accessibility already. But I always like to start off with the why. Why accessibility? Why should we worry about accessibility? Accessibility is not just, we shouldn't cover it just because we got a letter from the OCR or we got a complaint from someone on campus. I really like to say, I gave my why I worked at the university that I worked at for 17 years, was a web manager there, and accessibility became a really big topic after we had a student come to me and said that our website was terrible. And I kind of needed some explanation around that, but he met with me that day, and he did have a disease that affected his nervous system, and he could not use a mouse or any type of device to navigate our website. And so he was restricted to using a keyboard. And that's how he attempted to get to our content that we had on our website. And he had a really hard time navigating that. So it was really like we were putting a roadblock in front of him to get to our content. And I like to equate that as we would not put physical roadblocks on our campus to people who were trying to visit our buildings or our admissions office. And so why would we do that online or do that on our website? And not a week went by that I didn't get a call from someone. Maybe it was someone who had an issue reading our links in our footer because of the dark background and the light text and that sort of thing. So really, I started with a why. The team that I managed, sometimes they needed to know why before they just went off and did the task. So, like I said, you're showing some initiative today to look ahead to see what the guidelines are going to be, and that would be our why. And what is accessibility? We're going to talk about kind of the early days of accessibility was everyone was concerned and focused on the visual aspect, people who may have visual impediments to be able to see the content. But we know that accessibility is much more than just a visual aspect. As we look at the new WCAG 2 guidelines, they're going to cover more than just the visual aspect. They're going to cover some cognitive disabilities and really just make their website more accessible for a large audience. Who is responsible? At my university, they said, David, this is you. You're responsible. And it really had to have some education behind teaching that it was everyone's responsibility. It was a top-down responsibility. And it wasn't just on the shoulders of one person. It was all of your editors had to take some responsibility for accessibility. And sometimes we had to oversee and educate, but it's really not just a one-person responsibility. and then when. And like I said, we'll go over the new guidelines today. When do we need to worry, or when do we need to plan for accessibility? And I always like to tell everyone as soon as possible. You don't want to get to the end of your web project and you've gone through the committees, you've gone through the approval processes, you've gotten the president or chancellor sign off, and then you look at accessibility and you check it for any issues with accessibility. It really wants to be from the upfront, interactive, wireframe, mock-up stage, all the way through, checking to make sure that you're not putting any roadblocks in front of anyone. And then where does your site need to be accessible? And there's, I don't know if you guys follow the UFD listserv, but a few weeks ago there was talk about external websites that I linked to, internal websites, faculty websites. It's not just your homepage that you have to look at accessibility. Really, now that we look at search analytics, your homepage or your first page that people visit could be any interior page. So really, you need to look at an overall view of your site when we're talking about accessibility. So there's kind of my 5 W's of accessibility before we jump in. And we're going to talk about new accessibility guidelines. So, hard to believe, but WCAG or WCAG2 is almost a decade old. And we say a decade, 10 years, and we think about that in digital years. And that is a huge, huge time frame in digital years. So the new working recommendation for WCAG 2.1 was supposed to be released in May 2018. I think they've pushed it back to June. But this is a large working committee that's coming up with this guideline. So there are a lot of people that are reviewing it, but we do expect it to be in the next couple of months. And it really focuses on 3 new areas. So as we think about 10 years ago, where we were in the mobile aspect, what devices we had, what mobile phones we had back in 2008. And we know that platform really evolves rapidly. So there's really no surprise that accessibility needs to kind of increase there when it refers to mobile technology. So we need to address that aspect. And low vision, that's the second kind of area that WCAG 2.1 focuses on. Low vision's been documented for years in the original guideline, but kind of the latest reports, 246 million people worldwide deal with low vision. And so that's really an aspect that they're looking at with the new guidelines. And then more and more studies being done on cognitive research and cognitive disabilities. And so just being able to make sure that there's a consistency and dealing with a large range of issues that users may have, whether it be from just focusing on one area, having your navigation in one consistent area throughout the site. And then backward compatible, making sure that WCAG 2.1 does not replace WCAG 2. So it is backward compatible. It's just kind of they work in concert together. So it's not replacing 2. It's just adding on these new features. And now let's kind of get into the new guideline and talk about them in plain English. So number 1 is orientation. And I like to call this the never-ending steering wheel interface. I get on to my parents and my in-laws. They have iPads, and they'll get to a website and they'll turn it one way or the other. So they may be looking at it in portrait and they're going to turn it to landscape, but it takes a second for it to catch up. So then they try to turn it back to landscape and then back to portrait. So that's what I call this orientation. But it's really to make sure that the functionality, the features, and the content are available in both landscape and portrait mode. And so, early on in responsive design, this was kind of the thought process is we'd have one desktop view, and then the mobile view, we would just get rid of some of the content, or we would, just hide it for mobile devices. But this orientation view is really for devices that may be mounted. So if we think of on a wheelchair, we may have an iPad that's mounted, and it's really difficult, if not impossible, to change the orientation of a mounted device that's being used in that manner. So really making sure that the functionality does not change, the features don't change, and the content doesn't change, no matter whether the user's looking at this device in portrait or landscape mode. And I really did want to focus on, I won't go back to the 5 W's there, but talking about who we need to be accessed for. I think this is a perfect example here when we talk about orientation. There's kind of 3 areas here. We talk about kind of accessibility for users, permanent, so maybe permanent disability or permanent aspect of maybe someone who has one arm for a user interface, and temporary, someone who has an arm injury. So somebody who has the temporary use of only one arm, and then situational. So maybe a new parent where they're having to hold a baby constantly. My wife and I have a 6-month-old. She's constantly on her, she has to use the web on her phone, and she's holding our daughter. So that would be situational. But we look at all 3 of those areas. The way that a person interacts with a website is going to be similar, but it's going to be by the use of one hand there. So thinking about how the keyboard interacts, how maybe the mouse interacts, or just the touch screen interacts. So orientation is the number 1 guideline there for the WCAG 2.0 or 2.1 update. The second one there is identify input purpose. And so this has always been kind of the accessibility number 1 for forms, is you always want to have labels for your inputs. But this would be having a common labeling system for common input fields. And this is to meet some needs for the cognitive disabilities, so that they could have a future-proof automatic loading of symbols to identify common inputs. So maybe there's an issue with the labeling that you're already doing, which is fully accessible. But this would have some icon sets that some users would be able to automatically input on input fields. So instead of the physical text label for name, there would be a common icon that people would know that would automatically switch out. So it's really just some common labeling for input fields. And hopefully you're already doing labeling for all of your input fields for your guidelines, which meets WCAG 2 already. Reflow is number 3 on the guidelines there. And this is mainly for responsive sites. And I like to say, should I use horizontal scrolling? And the answer is always no. You don't want to have that horizontal scrolling for responsive sites. So if you're on a mobile phone, having to scroll horizontally is really a big no-no for responsiveness. And then as we talk about WCAG 2.1, it's really a big no-no because we talk about low vision users having to zoom into the screen. And this increases the horizontal scrolling 40 to 100 times. So you may say, well, on a mobile device, I really don't have to scroll that much for this horizontal content. But you really have to keep in mind for users who have to zoom into the screen, it really increases that horizontal scrolling. And I like to say scrolling for days. So you don't really want someone who's having to zoom into their screen to have to go through scrolling for that horizontal content. The next one is NonText Contrast. So we're hopefully you're getting used to the color contrast accessibility guidelines that are currently in place. But now this kind of reaches a little bit further to any non-text contrast. So any text you may have on images that you're including there, or any icons that you have. I was working with a site the other day, and there was some really contrast issues with some icons that they were using as buttons. So I like to say, can I use this black icon on a black background? So it's really keeping in mind any element that you have on the page, not just text that's being considered for color contrast. So it extends really that current color contrast guidelines and includes any graphics that you may have, any overlays that you may have for call to actions, or any text you may have over images themselves. And one of my favorite, the next one is text spacing. A lot of times I have Zoom set up on my Mac so that I can zoom into text. This really kind of goes for the aspect of not hard coding aspects of your text that's on the website. And so that screen readers and any assistive technologies that users are have in place, that they'll be able to resize the text automatically. So whether they have their browser set to be increased to 200%, a lot of times there's code that is just kind of embedded into websites that really restricts that aspect. And so, like I said, this will be for low vision users having that ability to override the spacing and the line height that you've set up already. And there's some guidelines there. It's kind of been a moving target with what they've set as the defaults. That's why I didn't list them here, but once they come out with the guideline, there'll kind of be something to go by here so that everybody won't be just trying to guess and check what the guideline is. Next is a hover on focus content, and we see this a lot as being used as maybe an icon that you hover over and it displays text or displays a link behind it. And a lot of times this is kind of being lost on mobile devices anyway, where you can't really hover over a screen. I know on iOS devices, if you double click on it, it gives you the same action as a hover. I like to call this the peekaboo content or hide and seek content. What content is being displayed behind a action or behind a rollover, a click. And this could be for mobile devices where the content's not being displayed. It could be on those users who may have some sort of disability with motor skills. Maybe they can't physically move the mouse over top of the area that you have. Or maybe once they're using tab navigation, it doesn't function properly when they tab over those icons or those images. So really making sure that you're not hiding any content behind a user action. And pointer gestures. And once the phones get more complex, and I like to kind of call this the spreading your hand all across the screen. Maybe you have some action where just because you can do it doesn't mean you should be able to, that you should be programming it this way, but maybe you have an action where your index finger's on the left, your pinky's on the bottom, and your ring finger's in the middle. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but just making sure that you're being very direct at how you interact with the website. They're really complex hand gestures to accomplish tasks. I know on the mobile devices now, you kind of have the pinch to zoom, or you have the 3-finger rotate, and all those different features, but really being intentional about how you're interacting with your website on mobile devices. And pointer cancellation. If you're on your mobile device, and just being able to cancel any action that you may encounter, or any person that accidentally touched the button, and what action is going to take place at that point. So, just being able to cancel any inadvertent touching of the item or area in any action or event that may trigger. So you'd be able to actually cancel that, and really just coming up with maybe a alert box in between those two. If it's a click this button and then this action takes place, and are you sure you want this action to take place? Just being able to cancel that before it just kind of runs off and does its thing. And also the next one is character key shortcuts. So very similar to the last one. I like this kind of the stop. In my household we have an Amazon device, we have Apple devices. Sometimes my kids get confused who to talk to. They don't know if they're talking to Alexa, if they're talking to Siri, whoever's listening. But just being able to stop. And this kind of goes back, as I said, to the being able to cancel an event that they have triggered inadvertently. This is really for text-to-speech users that may be, whether they're using a screen reader and they're interacting with your website over speech, but being able to stop an action easily. Maybe a keyboard shortcut. We know some websites now interact with keyboard shortcuts, being able to use the keyboard to fire different actions off. Sometimes the text-to-speech may come up and take over with those keyboard shortcuts. So just being able to cancel those features. And this goes along also with just because the feature is out there doesn't mean we should program or develop interfaces to take advantage of these features, but any type of motion, what they called motion actuation. And I like to say this is a dance to activate X feature. And we saw this popular with some iOS features that came out to shake your phone to reset, or tilt the phone this way to be able to get to this area of the app or the website. And I think always be intentional, like I said, with the development that you're doing. At the university that I was at, we said that we always wanted to be on the cutting edge, but we didn't want to be on the bleeding edge of technology. So I always had to go back and forth with a developer who was always developing and wanting to push the envelope. And I had to kind of say, let's step back and see exactly why are we using this feature. Is it accessible? Are we putting any roadblocks in the way of people being able to get to this content? So the motion actuation, just being able to make sure that you're not putting features above your content. And it goes back to maybe someone who has a mounted device. The device can't easily be shaken or tilted in that area to be able to get to that content. And some of these guidelines and these features on your website, you may say, I don't even know where I would even use that feature. And so that's good. You don't even have to worry about meeting this guideline because you wouldn't have been using this feature to begin with. Status messages, I think this is a great guideline to put in place because we've all been on a website and we've clicked a button and we've sat there and we've waited and we said, did anything happen? Did I need to click this button again? So really just making sure that you're being, that you have your status messages, success messages, failure messages, make them easy to see. Sometimes they can be hard to see. They may show up in the bottom right-hand corner, and sometimes users miss them. But just making sure that the user knows that action is either completed or success or it failed. And this could be submitting forms. I think that's always a good being able to know that your form has been submitted. Have a failure message, and there's a whole set of guidelines already in place for what you do for notifications and failures for forms. This just kind of reiterates that guideline that's already in place. And so everything we've talked about so far in the plain English has been the WCAG 2.1, and it's either been single A or double A. And so the WCAG body, they're still using that single A up to triple A guidelines. As I said, they're using it in concert with WCAG 2 that's already being used. But there are 5 more proposed guidelines that would fall under the AAA guideline. And most of the schools that we work with now, they're trying to meet or exceed the WCAG 2 AA. And so these AAA guidelines that they've proposed that would be great to meet, but it's kind of we're going to put these in place, and really it's going to be for future future use. But number 1, we have identify purpose, and this would be not just to have components, icons, or certain sections, but a user should understand more than a button is a button. And they need to understand what that button does, what its purpose is. When I click on this button, what's going to happen? Also timeouts. And this is really just to inform your user that they're going to lose data if they don't submit or they don't complete this action within a certain amount of time. I think we've probably all been filling out a form at some point, and we filled it out, and maybe we got called away or something happened, and we came back and we tried to hit submit, and it had timed out. So really it's more about kind of setting those expectations with the user. We also have animations from interactions. And this could be animations have to deal with scroll events or video that's playing in the background. And that would just being able to give the users the ability to pause that video or turn off that video. For users who may have motion sickness or something similar to that, and just being able to turn off those interactions and those animations. Target size. This one, may affect you if you're trying to meet that AAA guideline, but this really says every clickable element other than text must be 44 by 44 pixels wide. And this goes back to being able to, you kind of having that dexterity to be able to click on an element. Sometimes, maybe we have a social media icon that's really small, and if you can't get that mouse just right, being able to click on that, or someone that's on a mobile device, and you're trying to click on that link on a mobile device, and I'm sure we've probably all done it. We've clicked on the wrong link because the other two links were really close in proximity to that one link that we really wanted. And concurrent input mechanisms. So this is really just being able to utilize multiple inputs. So maybe you're on a tablet and just being able to utilize the keyboard that's plugged in, or a pen device, not limiting actions that are on certain input devices. So really that's the new WCAG guideline. That's kind of in plain English. I hope that helped a little bit. So once we hear about the new WCAG 2 guidelines coming out, it won't be a scary thing. I know once I heard, we've been working so hard to meet these WCAG 2 guidelines, or trying to make our site accessible, and then we're going to come out with a new set of guidelines. So it's not really a new set of guidelines. It's just an updated set for, as we talked about, mobile, responsive, and a couple of different areas to work in concert with what we're already doing on our site. And we talked about the original WCAG 2.1 was supposed to come out in May, and they're still kind of working on a few of those guidelines. And I think that the new updated release date I've seen is June. So it'll be finalized really and be released out to everyone. But as we look at it in our area, it may be years before it is required. But at least we know kind of the guideline that we're working toward. And so the European Union is likely to make it a requirement in 2019, but it's really, as I said, a guideline that we can future-proof now. At the university I was at, we kind of had this goal every 3 years that we would redesign our site. So as you're maybe in the planning stages, or maybe in the middle stages of a redesign or an update or remediation, just kind of keep these new guidelines in the back of your mind and work towards the goal to have that site already accessible for the new guidelines before they even come out. So now I'm going to jump into kind of the second part.
Actually, before we go on, there's a couple of questions that came in that we could address. So one is from Tracy Jeanette, and she says, do you know what type of search on mobile is most accessible or recommended? Some now have it that you have to press something in order for the search box to sort of slide in to appear.
Yeah, I think, we have guidelines, so they can be interpreted multiple ways. I think that once you start looking at the accessibility, I think all those areas would meet accessibility, and it really comes into usability. And you kind of have to put that hat on of what is the less number of clicks for me to actually get to the search results. What interaction? Do I want to have to click 3 times to get to the search box, to the search results, or do I want to just click in the search box and click search?
And then another question we have is from Allison Gold. And she says, for the status messages, I've noticed that when we create a form in OU Campus, if someone doesn't fill in a required field, it isn't clear where the error is unless you scroll up the page and search for it. It's not always really clear that there is a problem until you realize that the form wasn't submitted. Is there something in the works to fix this?
I haven't seen that issue. We can look into that. A common kind of fix for that is once you hit submit and it comes back with an error message, it really just scrolls to top of the actual form itself, so that we can look and see where the validation errors or the required fields weren't filled in. So I don't know if maybe if you want to enter a support ticket for that particular case, or I can also make a note of that so that we can look in that and see if that's see if there's something that we can do to fix that.
All right, that's all the questions for now.
Okay. Good questions. All right. I go back. So accessibility remediation. So I know every school pretty much I talked with in my former school, they're kind of in some kind of area of accessibility remediation. They're either at the very beginning of it, or they're kind of in the what I call the maintain phase. They're kind of reached that overall accessibility of the site, and they're just kind of in the day-to-day operations of making sure things are accessible. And really, when I talk about accessibility remediation, I've helped probably 10 or 11 different universities with the remediation and kind of a handful of companies, and everybody kind of has their unique situations. So I really like to cover some different areas or some common areas that people run into. Template level, these are my favorite remediation areas because these are those areas where it may be in the global navigation and you fix it once and it updates it on every page. Or the search box, as we just had that question, or page level. So this would be on the individual page, maybe header nesting or those particular things that are really on a page-by-page basis. And these take a little more time, and sometimes educating our content editors on these because they may be the ones that are consistently making these errors. So I'm going to jump right into some template level issues and remediation and how to fix these. So navigation, as I mentioned, the student that I met with had a really hard time navigating our website. I see more and more websites now. They're doing doing great things with navigation and keyboard navigation. As we see here in this example, we have a blue box around our focus area. And so, easy way to test your website. As soon as you load your website up, don't even think about using the mouse. Just start hitting tab on your website. And how does it navigate your website? Do you get lost? So we see here it has what we call a focus area, ring around where our tab navigation is. A lot of sites, for the design reasons, they've turned off that focus area. So you have really no clue where you are when you're tabbing. Just by looking at the status bar at the bottom, you may see the link, but there's no visual feedback of where you are. So number one thing is being able to tab navigate. And there are a lot of different things to think about when you're doing tab navigation. One is that focus and that design. There's also tab order. Does that make sense? When I hit tab, does it jump me all over the page? Do I go to students, then it goes to about, and then it goes down to the footer and then back up? So making sure your tab order is logical, making sure that the tab doesn't go off the screen. So maybe you have content that is off the screen, but it comes in when you're doing some sort of scrolling or interaction with clicking. So making sure that tab navigation is going to the correct spot, the order is correct. And I had a school this morning I was talking with, they're going and starting to do mega navs. And this kind of goes into the area of how you're interpreting the guideline. So when they're tabbed through, for example, here with admissions, academics, this school did not use any drop-down navigations. But the school I was talking to this morning has mega navs under admissions. And by mega nav, I mean they had 6 columns of 10 links. And the site just tabs over to the main navigation, admissions, academics. But they wanted it to tab through every menu that's under those main areas. And so we think about a user who's having to use tab, navigation, or a screen reader. If they want to get to athletics, they have to go through, I'm terrible at math. They have to go through a whole bunch of links to get to athletics because they're going through every main nav plus every mega nav link to get to there. Both are accessible, they meet the guidelines, but what's more usable for a user who's having to use a screen reader or tab navigation? So those are some things to keep in mind there with navigation. Skip content. This is another one that I always like to recommend for accessibility. Is the first link that comes up when I hit tab is a menu comes up that allows me to skip to the main content. So if I'm going to a website and I want to get to a link that is in the content of the page, I don't want to have to go through every top level navigation. I just want to hit tab and hit enter to skip to my main content. So that is a very good aspect to be able to incorporate into the site. I have a question from Ryan. Would you use other keyboard keys for navigating your mega menu? Yes. So that was one option that I told the schools about. So you can hit tab, and then once you get to that overall main nav, you can hit the arrow keys to drop down to the mega nav. And so that's kind of the best of both worlds. So I can tab through to get to the main ones, or I can tab, have some type of visual feedback to know that there is a menu under that main navigation, and then hit my arrow keys to drop down to navigate those mega navs. And also the school that I use as an example here, when you click on admissions, they basically have a landing page for admissions that has all those internal links. So they're not losing any links by not using drop downs. They just chose to put all those links on a landing page for their main kind of first level sites. Another common aspect that I see for accessibility issues are form labels. So, almost 99.99% of college and university websites, they have a search box for their global header that's on every page. And one common error that I see that it'll come up with your accessibility reports is not having form labels on these search boxes. So here we see this search box has search in the search box, but that's what we call placeholder text. That's not used for any accessibility. It's really just for you to be able to see kind of the placeholder there. We know when we click on search there, the search would disappear and I can type in my search term. But it has to have some sort of label for that input so that screen readers know what is supposed to be entered into that input. And as this school is used, they use what we call an SR only tag. So it's screen reader only. It's not visually displayed, but on the back end there is a label that goes with this input. So anyone that's using a screen reader, it reads out what that label is for. Color contrast. The school that worked for, our main color, our primary color, and our secondary color did not meet color contrast, so we could not use a lot of times those colors in conjunction with each other. So being able to really know what those high and low contrast colors are going to be, and being able to utilize them on your site. So whether you're using in your navigation, you have one color for your global nav background and being able to have your link colors, and just making sure that those meet color contrast accessibility ratios. And there are a lot of different the ratios there depending on what guideline you're trying to meet. If you do a Google search for color contrast accessibility, there are a lot of checkers there where you can enter a background and foreground color, and you can test out the color contrast and what size, depending on what size your text is, too, kind of meets that accessibility contrast. And you can play around with the colors, the different hex values. You can go lighter and darker and meet kind of what that accessibility for color contrast is. And as we talked about, that's getting more and more common now too with using images, so text on images with that background. So there's more of our template level issues. So our page level issues, sometimes these are harder to fix because we may have to go page by page, or it may be something that we have to kind of split apart to student workers if you're fortunate enough to have some of those. I've had great student workers in the past, and I've had some that I had to work a little bit with. But page level issues, as I kind of grade out the overall global level elements here and focused on the page level issues. Form labels. We talked about form labels. If you have an input, you've got to have a label. I mean, you've got to associate those two together. You can't really have any. Common practice a few years ago was we would take the labels off, and you could use the inputs with the placeholders. We had some designers, and they were, let's get rid of the labels, and we'll use just the boxes with the inputs with the placeholder text. Just always put labels there with it, with your inputs. Header nesting. This is a common issue that we see because historically a lot of times people have used headers as design, where really it's supposed to be the architecture or the hierarchy of your page content. This is not only good for accessibility, it's also good for search engine optimization. And so here we see there are kind of two trains of thought with header nesting. Historically, you always, if you had an H1, which you always want to have an H1, but you wanted to have that followed up by an H2, and then you wanted to go in order. So either an H2 had to follow an H2 or an H3. With kind of the invent of HTML5 and the section label, we really wanted to also have that area there so that you could reset. So with our example here, we see H1, and then we have a section of H2 and then H3, and then another section with H2, H3, H3. So really just being, again, intentional about how you're using your headers. They're not there for design. So your H1 may be large, it may be bold, and then your H2 may be a different color, and then your H3 may be another color. We don't want the content editors changing just because they want a different color. It's really to set up the overall architecture of your page. And one of my favorite that I used to talk with our content editors is alt text on images. Here we have an image. Kind of people know basically now, if you're in OU campus, you can't put an image on a page without an alt text. And really here it gets to be about not whether you have alt text on an image or not, it's whether you actually have proper context on an image. Because we can all say pretty campus building and then move on to the next image. But what is the context of this image? And screen readers are going to read the alt text of this image. So why do you have this image on the page? Is it describing something? Is it why is the image there really? And so we can check off a box here, or we can do it right. So take the additional few seconds and do it right, and put the correct alt text there inside of your pages on your images. SVGs, I know we're moving more towards that with logos and vector images. SVGs also have to have alt text, but it's really the title text inside of those. So really you don't get away from using an alt text on an SVG. Just some things to keep in mind there. Proper HTML code, the B tag, the I tag, the font tag, all these really speak to users who are using that assistive technology to change the font, change the size on a page. Screen readers historically can't read the B tag for bold. We suggest using the strong tag instead of the B tag, using the EM tag instead of the I, and really just not using the font tag at all. Just using CSS or some other form to style that text. Empty links. This is one that comes up in page check and final check, but there's really no visual feedback if you have an empty link on your page. It's just kind of in the HTML, the code behind that. Sometimes you may bring it in, or you may have deleted something and the WYSIWYG said, okay, now there's an empty link on my page. And this really, for a couple of reasons, it's not valid HTML and it's not valid for accessibility purposes. Screen readers will just have an empty link there, and there'll just be kind of an empty link hanging out. So just being able to notify you that there is an empty link and being able to drop in and get rid of that. Unique IDs. So we have some demo code here, but basically telling you that you have to have unique IDs. And anytime, I always say use classes instead of IDs. I know there are cases where you have to use IDs. I would use them sparingly. Always use a class instead, but you have to have unique IDs on a page. And that's really just, a lot of times we'll see someone maybe using a scroll back to top feature on their website, and they're using kind of a generic ID there. Maybe they have a search box that's using an ID, and they're using another search box for mobile, and it's using the same ID. So just being consistent that there's only one ID that you're using on a page, so unique IDs. Some toolkit things. You guys are probably all familiar with page check, so you can run that at any time while you're editing the page. That checks, those 4 areas of your page, but we're kind of focused on accessibility. So it checks accessibility against the guideline that you've set up in OU Campus. And so you'll be able to check your page while you're working on it and be able to see any errors that you have. And then final check does the exact same thing, except it's when you publish before you go live with the site, with the page. And I think there are a couple of new features that maybe you're not aware about. You can actually restrict publishing of the page if it doesn't meet accessibility check and final check. And we've seen a couple of schools do that, and then they kind of walked it back a little bit and said, well, maybe we'll still let them publish. We'll just make sure that we're looking at it overall. And then OU Insights. OU Insights is our tool that checks on a frequency basis. So you can set it to check daily, weekly, or monthly. And this goes through the entire site. So any page that's managed within OU Campus and checks SEO, more technical aspects of SEO, checks any spelling errors, and it integrates with your custom dictionary that you have, broken links, and accessibility. And this is nice because it catches any of those pages that may be out there without your knowledge. It gives you an overall score and gives you a report that you can kind of work toward to increase that score. So there's some kind of internal accessibility toolkit items that you can use, and then I always like to share some external tools that I've used in the past and that others have told me about. In the newest version of Chrome and DevTools, they have an accessibility checker. You can just open up Inspect Element or the DevTools box there and run an audit on it, and part of that audit is accessibility checks. We can also use the Wave plugin that's put out by a WebAIM, and that checks more on a page-by-page basis, but it gives you kind of visual feedback of where your accessibility errors are. One that somebody told me about at our OUTC conference is the No Coffee plugin for Chrome, and it's a visual simulator, and it has, I think it's over 15 to 20 different kind of visual impairments that you can simulate just by this plugin, and being able to see how different users see your content. And ChromeVox is a voiceover tool for Chrome, so it can kind of give you a different aspect of how someone would use a screen reader through Chrome. And then some mobile tools. On iOS, there's VoiceOver that you can turn on to be able to navigate your phone and Safari or different web browsers on iOS devices. And then Android has a talkback feature to be able to test that. And a couple of websites that I listed here for good for design patterns. So maybe if you want to incorporate a mobile search on your site, some of this code is already written, it's already fully accessible, and it's tested. And so you can get some ideas at a11yproject.com and a11ymatters.com. So a couple of websites there that you can look at and give you some ideas about future features that you want to add, or really maybe just cleaning up some features that you already have on your website. So I know we have a few questions that have come in, so I'm going to address those.
Yes, so the first question is from Eric Odom, who asks, do empty elements only apply to links? For instance, could I use a span with the middle commented out to display an icon?
Usually it comes back with any empty element that you have. So if you have elements, so if you have a span that has an icon in the middle, you really, I would say, utilize that SR only tag. So there is text inside there that's giving it some sort of context. So that way the text doesn't display, but it's not an empty element there that really doesn't have any context behind it.
And then Elisa Stromberg asks, as an additional option, and not to take away from meeting WCAG compliance, are widgets add-ons that allow page modifications, e.g. color, contrast, font size, etc., something that is frowned upon or encouraged?
I don't really think it's frowned upon. I think now a lot of times the user will have some sort of kind of assistive technology on their end, but I think you're probably referring to kind of what we've seen in the past, maybe a plus or minus that's built into the content area. So on the page, I can increase the text or decrease the text. I think anything that you can do to increase the accessibility of a page. So if you have a user who's visually impaired and maybe they're not on their home computer, so being able to increase or decrease that text would still be useful for them.
And then another question from Elisa asking, do you have a list of good accessibility compliant higher ed websites?
I currently do not, but I do not. I know if you look at some of these accessibility sites, they'll have examples on them for good design, good usability, and good accessibility. I always like to look at WebAIM, the makers that use the Wave plugin, and I think they are sponsored by a university, so you can look at that website as well, and look at a couple of the websites that they link to as good examples. And now I found myself a lot of times now when I go to a school's website, I'll open up the Wave plugin to see how they're doing with accessibility. And so a lot of times the schools now that I'm finding are getting 100% accessibility and are passing with flying colors. So just looking at what some other schools are doing.
Christopher Friedel says California State University Northridge is our accessibility sponsor, so their website might be a good one to look at. And then let's see, another question from Jennifer Bohm, who says, when dealing with graphs such as bar charts or pie graphs, I learned through research that a long description is needed to make these compliant. I'm under the impression that OU Campus doesn't support that particular tag, so would posting the description under the graph suffice, or are there other ways to handle this situation?
Yeah, definitely. Putting a long description on the code behind, in the HTML is a solution. But in the case of graphs and maybe even images that have more descriptive context with them, putting a caption or putting a description under them is meeting accessibility and also just being user-friendly. So maybe I don't want to sit here and try to interpret this graph, but I just want to read the description that you've attached with it.
And then another question from Nicole Harrison says, I always run into potential problems on scripts we have on our web pages for a third-party service that scans our website or a tracking pixel for ad tracking, since they do not provide any information or content. Can these issues be ignored?
Yeah, I think, Google is notorious for this with putting their map code and some other code that you would insert. And you would think with some of these large companies that, I only have this one small snippet of code. Can we not just make it accessible because it's really pulling my site down? But there are some ways around it. If you just Google whatever service or whatever third party you're pulling in and see if someone has already provided code that's accessible. And sometimes you just can't get the accessible code that you're having to add, and it's really code behind. So you're not putting a roadblock in between a user and your content. It's really for your own purpose for using that code. So yeah, it's something that you can kind of just ignore there.
Then Robert Chesser asks, are OU Campus's page and content editing tools accessible?
They are accessible. We have what we call a VPAT. So it's an accessibility standard that we have to meet on the back end of items. So I think one example is for our versioning. If you look under versioning, we have a green underline, a red strike through, a blue squiggly line to look at those versions and the descriptions there. But so yes, I mean you'd be able to fully utilize the back end of OU Campus with a screen reader and those tools for that different users use for assistive technologies.
Okay. I'm not seeing any more questions come in, but while I wait for any sort of last questions, I'm going to talk about what's coming up next. So next month's Training Tuesday is going to be held on June 26th, and we're going to be talking about social media meta tags relating to, say if you share a page on a social media website, something about like the image that is auto-filled or the text, things like that. And thank you everyone for attending. The recorded presentation materials and PowerPoint slides will be available on our support site shortly. And it looks like we've got one more question that came in. Allison Gold says, you mentioned being able to stop a page from being published without the final check validating. Can you tell us how to do that?
Sure. So it's under the site setup and the account setup. So you'd have to go through there and look under publishing. And there you can restrict publishing by one of those final check icons. So whether it be accessibility or W3C validation, but you can check one of those boxes there to restrict publishing.
Yes, if you go to setup sites, the site that you want to edit, site settings, and then publish settings, there are final check options, and you can choose, you can force final check, you can choose which options for final check you want, such as spell check, link check, accessibility check, and then there's an option to enable publish button either always or only when certain conditions such as a check are passed. And you can read more about that on our support site as well. Okay. All right, and last chance for any questions. All right, well, thank you everybody very much for attending. Once again, all this will be recorded and the slides will be available on our support site. And one last thing, don't forget to fill out the feedback survey once this session ends. We love hearing from you, and it helps us tailor our Training Tuesdays to what you want to see and is what most helpful for you as well. Oh, one more question in right before the gate. Amy Hutchings says, similar to your solution for graphs where a long description can be added for complex images, can you do something similar for PDFs when the information is complex and not accessible?
I'm honestly not sure about the PDF spec for accessibility in terms of just being able to put a description under those particular areas. I mean, I've used Acrobat to be able to scan, check accessibility for PDFs, but I'm not sure if you can get kind of get around that with the long description in PDF files themselves.
Okay, great. And also just if you have any questions further after this, feel free to email the training team, or if you have something specific to your site that you need a fix for, send in a support ticket and we'll get that looked at. All right, and thank you everybody very much for attending. Have a great rest of your day.